Alexander the Great. How did a 32-year life reshape the ancient world? Alexander was born in 356 BCE and died in 323 BCE. His reign lasted only about 13 years, yet in that short span he became one of history's most famous commanders and helped create the Hellenistic world. His story is not a simple hero tale. Courage, curiosity, brilliance, violence, ambition, and authoritarian rule all belong in the same account. Alexander was born at Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon in what is now northern Greece. His father was King Philip II. His mother, Olympias, was a princess from Epirus, west of Macedon. Alexander therefore grew up inside a royal family where politics, marriage, military power, and personal rivalry were tightly connected. From childhood, he was being prepared not merely to live at court, but to compete for power and eventually rule. Macedon had not always been the strongest state in the Greek world. Farther south stood famous city-states such as Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. During Alexander's childhood, however, Philip II transformed Macedon into a military superpower. This matters because Alexander did not begin with a weak kingdom and invent an empire from nothing. He inherited a stronger state, a disciplined army, experienced officers, and a plan for war against Persia. Philip reorganized the Macedonian army into a coordinated machine. He strengthened the infantry, developed powerful cavalry, improved siege equipment, and created an experienced professional officer corps. Instead of relying only on short-term citizen soldiers, Macedon could field troops who trained and campaigned together. Alexander's genius would lie in using this system with extraordinary speed and flexibility, but much of the system itself was Philip's achievement. Macedonian infantrymen fought in a phalanx, a tightly packed formation. Their main weapon was the sarissa, an extremely long spear carried with both hands. Imagine several rows of spear points projecting from a moving wall of soldiers. The formation was powerful from the front, but it needed discipline and protection on its sides. Alexander later combined this infantry with cavalry and lighter troops rather than expecting the phalanx to win every battle alone. Around 343 BCE, when Alexander was about 13, Philip arranged for the philosopher Aristotle to help educate him. Alexander studied literature, philosophy, science, medicine, and politics. He was especially fascinated by Homer's Iliad, the epic of the Trojan War, and reportedly admired the warrior Achilles. Ancient writers present this heroic model as deeply important to him. Even so, education did not make Alexander a philosopher king in any simple sense. Learning and ruthless power would coexist throughout his life. One famous story says that nobody could control a horse named Bucephalus. The young Alexander supposedly noticed that the horse feared its own shadow, turned it toward the sun, and rode it. Philip then predicted that his son would need a kingdom large enough for his ambition. It is a perfect story, but writers such as Plutarch and Arrian lived centuries later. Major events are well established, while dramatic conversations and childhood scenes may have been polished, exaggerated, or invented. In 338 BCE, Philip defeated a coalition led by Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. Alexander, about 18 years old, fought in the battle and received an important command. The victory made Philip the dominant ruler in Greece. Philip then organized many Greek states into the League of Corinth and prepared a massive invasion of the Persian Empire. Alexander was already gaining real military and political experience before he became king. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated by one of his bodyguards, Pausanias, during a royal celebration. The exact motives remain debated. Alexander suddenly became king at about 20. His new position was dangerous. Rival relatives could challenge him, northern peoples could rebel, and Greek cities could try to escape Macedonian control. The planned Persian invasion now depended on whether this very young king could survive the crisis at home. Alexander moved with astonishing speed. He secured recognition as king, dealt with possible rivals, marched north against rebellious peoples, and made clear that Philip's death had not ended Macedonian power. These actions protected the throne, but they also revealed a pattern that would define his rule. He answered threats rapidly and often violently. Alexander's career cannot be separated from his willingness to eliminate opposition before it could grow. When Thebes revolted in 335 BCE, Alexander returned south, captured the city, and destroyed it. Many defenders were killed, and many survivors were enslaved. The destruction sent a terrifying message to the rest of Greece. Resistance could bring catastrophe. Most other Greek states submitted. The episode also establishes the human cost of Alexander's success before he ever entered Asia. Military brilliance did not make conquest humane. Alexander could now pursue the invasion his father had planned. The Achaemenid Persian Empire stretched across much of the Middle East, included Egypt, and reached deep into Western and Central Asia. Its king was Darius III. Persia was not a weak kingdom waiting to collapse. It was a vast, wealthy imperial system with regional governors, armies, roads, cities, and centuries of royal tradition. Alexander was beginning a war against the leading superpower of the age. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow waterway now called the Dardanelles, from Europe into Asia. The army may have included roughly 43,000 infantry and 5,500 cavalry, although ancient troop figures are never perfectly certain. Alexander visited places associated with the Trojan War and presented the campaign as both a Greek attack on Persia and a heroic expedition. He would never return to Macedon. Alexander's first major victory in Asia came at the Granicus River, in what is now Turkey. Persian regional governors positioned forces to stop him at the crossing. Alexander attacked aggressively and won, though the battle was dangerous and ancient accounts differ on details. The victory opened much of Western Asia Minor. Some cities accepted Macedonian control, others resisted and were attacked. The campaign was already becoming more than a single battlefield contest. It was a struggle for ports, roads, cities, and political loyalty. At Gordium stood a famous knot linked to a prophecy that whoever untied it would rule Asia. One ancient version says Alexander cut it with his sword. Another says he found a clever way to remove the pin holding it together. The exact act is uncertain. Like the Bucephalus story, the legend became memorable because it fit Alexander's reputation. Faced with a problem, he rejected ordinary limits and created a bold solution. Darius III now personally led an army against Alexander. The two forces met near Issus, close to the southeastern coast of modern Turkey. The narrow battlefield reduced some advantages of the larger Persian force. Alexander drove toward the Persian center, and Darius fled. The Macedonian victory was enormous. Alexander had not merely defeated regional governors, he had defeated the Persian king in person. Darius escaped from Issus, but his mother, wife, and children fell into Alexander's hands. Alexander treated them as royal prisoners rather than killing them. Ancient writers praised this as self-control, though captivity remained part of conquest. Darius attempted to negotiate, offering territory and alliance. Alexander refused. He was no longer satisfied with borderlands or a favorable treaty. He intended to replace Darius as ruler of the Persian Empire. The island city of Tyre in modern Lebanon refused to give Alexander full access. Its walls and offshore position made it extremely difficult to capture. For about 7 months, Alexander's forces built a huge causeway toward the island while engineers, siege machines, and ships attacked the defenses. Tyre eventually fell. Many people were killed, and thousands were enslaved. The siege displays Alexander's persistence and engineering skill, but also the savage punishment he imposed on cities that resisted. Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BCE and encountered little resistance because Egypt had been under Persian rule. Egyptian traditions recognized him as pharaoh. He later traveled across the desert to the oracle at Siwa, associated with the god Amun, whom Greeks connected with Zeus. Later stories claim that the oracle confirmed divine parentage, but exactly what was said is uncertain. The visit strengthened Alexander's sacred royal image, while leaving historians with more legend than certainty. On Egypt's Mediterranean coast, Alexander founded, or reorganized and named, the city of Alexandria. After his death, the Ptolemaic dynasty made it one of the ancient world's greatest centers of trade, scholarship, and culture. Alexander did not personally build the famous Library of Alexandria. The library and related institutions were developed by the Ptolemies. His role was to establish the city that later rulers transformed into an intellectual capital. Alexander marched back into Asia for the decisive struggle. On October 1st, 331 BCE, the armies met at Gaugamela, near modern northern Iraq. Darius chose open ground that favored his larger force and chariots. Alexander had to avoid being surrounded while finding a way to strike the Persian center. The battle would decide whether the Persian king could still hold his empire together. Alexander's method can be simplified with a hammer and anvil analogy. The phalanx acted somewhat like an anvil, holding enemy forces with its forest of spears. Alexander's elite companion cavalry acted like a hammer, delivering a hard blow at a weak point. At Gaugamela, careful maneuvering helped open a gap in the Persian formation. Alexander led a cavalry charge toward the center. Darius fled, and the Persian army collapsed. The analogy simplifies a complicated battle, but it shows how combined forces work together. After Gaugamela, Alexander occupied several of the empire's richest and most important cities, including Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. He seized immense royal treasuries and took control of administrative centers that connected the empire. Gaugamela had broken Darius's field power. Occupying these cities gave Alexander the resources and symbols of kingship. He was no longer leading a raiding expedition. He was taking possession of an imperial system. At Persepolis, one of the ceremonial centers of Persian royal power, Alexander's forces burned the great palace complex. Ancient sources disagree about why. Some describe deliberate revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece roughly a century and a half earlier. Others connect the fire with a drunken celebration. Historians cannot confidently reconstruct Alexander's exact motive. Whatever the cause, the destruction became a powerful symbol of the end of Achaemenid rule and a catastrophe for a major cultural site. Darius fled east but was arrested and killed by men connected with the commander Bessus, who tried to claim the throne. Alexander found Darius dead and presented himself increasingly as the murdered king's avenger and legitimate successor. The original goal of defeating Persia had effectively been achieved, yet Alexander continued. He was no longer simply a Macedonian king conquering a foreign empire. He was trying to become the ruler of that empire. Alexander pursued Bessus and other opponents through regions corresponding roughly to parts of modern Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and nearby lands. This became some of the hardest fighting of his career. Instead of one enormous army waiting in a field, he faced local resistance, mobile opponents, fortified places, mountains, and long supply lines. He captured Bessus and founded or renamed several cities called Alexandria, using them as military and administrative centers. Conquest here required years of pressure, not one famous charge. Alexander began adopting more features of Persian kingship: clothing, ceremonies, administrators, and nobles at court. Politically, this made sense. He ruled millions of non-Macedonians and could not govern the empire with Macedonians alone. But many followers believed he was becoming too Persian and too much like an absolute monarch. The conflict exposed a basic problem. The habits of a Macedonian war leader did not easily fit the needs of a multi-ethnic empire. In 330 BCE, the officer Philotas was accused in connection with a conspiracy and executed. Alexander then ordered the killing of Philotas's father, Parmenion. Parmenion had served Philip and was one of Alexander's most important senior commanders. He was killed before he could defend himself against any charge. The episode removed a powerful military family, but it also showed how far Alexander would go when he suspected disloyalty. In 328 BCE, during a drunken argument, Alexander killed Cletus the Black, an officer who had once helped save his life in battle. Ancient accounts say Alexander afterward felt intense regret, but regret could not undo the killing. In 327 BCE, the court historian Callisthenes opposed Persian-style practices and was arrested after a conspiracy involving royal pages. He later died. The brilliant young commander who entered Asia was becoming a more suspicious and authoritarian emperor. While in Central Asia, Alexander married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria or Sogdiana. The marriage may also have involved personal attraction, but it had clear political value. Alexander was trying to secure the eastern regions of his empire and build relationships with local elites. Roxana would later become pregnant with his posthumous son, Alexander IV. At the time, however, Alexander was still moving east toward the Indian subcontinent. When Greek writers spoke of India, they meant lands around and beyond the Indus River, much of which lies in modern Pakistan. Alexander crossed into this region in 327 and 326 BCE. Some local rulers allied with him, hoping to strengthen their own position. Others resisted. The campaign brought Macedonian forces into unfamiliar terrain, climates, and political systems after years of continuous war. Alexander's most famous battle in the region was against King Porus at the Hydaspes River, now the Jhelum River. Porus fielded war elephants, which frightened horses and could break infantry formations. Alexander used deception to conceal where his troops would cross the swollen river. After moving part of his army across, he defeated Porus in a difficult battle. Hydaspes showed his ability to adapt tactics to a new enemy, new weapon, and dangerous landscape. Alexander was reportedly impressed by Porus and allowed him to continue ruling under Macedonian authority. This was practical. A respected local ruler could help govern territory better than a distant conqueror alone. Around this period, Bucephalus died. Ancient accounts say Alexander named a city Bucephala in the horse's honor. The historical king and the legendary bull rider meet again here, near the farthest edge of his advance. Alexander wanted to continue farther east. His soldiers refused at the Hyphasis, now the Bios River. Many had left Macedon in 334 BCE and had marched and fought for about 8 years across thousands of kilometers. They had endured sieges, wounds, deserts, mountains, unfamiliar climates, and monsoon rains. Alexander tried to persuade them, but eventually gave in. The commander who had defeated every great army placed before him was stopped by his own exhausted men. The return west was not a safe victory march. While fighting the Malians, Alexander climbed into a defended city and was struck in the chest by an arrow, nearly dying. Later, part of the force returned by sea under Nearchus while Alexander led others through the Gedrosian Desert, across areas of modern Pakistan and Iran. Heat, thirst, hunger, and exhaustion caused terrible losses. His boldness inspired troops, but it could also expose them and him to needless danger. At Susa, Alexander organized mass marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen. He himself married Statira, a daughter of Darius, in addition to Roxana. He also incorporated Persians into the military and trained Iranian youths in Macedonian warfare. Historians debate whether he sought deep cultural fusion or mainly practical control. Many Macedonian veterans resented the policies, and troops protested at Opis. Reconciliation followed, but the crisis showed how difficult the empire had become to manage. At Ecbatana, Alexander's closest friend and senior commander, Hephaestion, died, probably from illness. Alexander was overwhelmed with grief and ordered extraordinary honors. Hephaestion had been both a personal companion and a major figure in imperial administration. His death removed someone Alexander trusted at a moment when the empire was already strained by conflict between Macedonian and Persian elites. Alexander returned to Babylon and was preparing further operations, including a campaign toward Arabia. Then he became seriously ill. After roughly 10 days of worsening sickness, he died in June 323 BCE, probably around June 10th or 11th. He was 32 in his 33rd year. Malaria, typhoid-like disease, other infections, past injuries, and poisoning have all been suggested. We simply do not know. Poisoning is dramatic, but the surviving evidence does not prove murder. Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant. His future son, Alexander IV, had not yet been born. His adult half-brother, Philip III Orhidius, could not exercise strong independent rule. Alexander's generals began struggling for control. Known as the Diadochi or successors, they fought for decades. Alexander's family was eventually eliminated, and the empire never again operated as one united state. Out of the successor wars emerged major Hellenistic kingdoms. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. Seleucus eventually controlled a vast Asian empire. Macedon passed through further struggles before the Antigonid dynasty became established. In one sense, Alexander's empire failed because it fractured immediately. Yet its successor states kept wide networks of cities, trade, armies, migration, and administration in motion. Greek-speaking settlers moved through Egypt and Asia, and Greek became widely used in government, trade, scholarship, and communication. But Hellenistic does not mean that everyone simply became Greek. Greek communities encountered Egyptian, Persian, Mesopotamian, Central Asian, Jewish, and other traditions. Art, religion, government, clothing, philosophy, and everyday customs mixed in new ways. Alexandria became a great intellectual center associated with figures such as Euclid and Eratosthenes. Alexander did not personally create every later achievement, but his conquests shattered old boundaries and helped create the environment in which they developed. Alexander became a model for later commanders because he coordinated heavy infantry, light troops, archers, cavalry, engineers, siege weapons, and scouts as parts of one machine. He moved quickly, adapted to different enemies and landscapes, and often placed himself near the fighting. His success also depended on capable officers and the army Philip had built. People often say he never lost a battle. He won the famous set-piece battles, but his wider campaigns included ambushes, setbacks, wounds, failed operations, and terrible losses. Unbeatable is too simple. Philip built the army Alexander inherited. Speed, combined arms, and siege skill drove the conquest. Alexander left no stable successor, so the empire fractured. Hellenistic exchange spread widely, but the human cost remained enormous. Historical importance does not make every action morally good. Question: why was Philip II essential to Alexander's success? Answer: Philip transformed Macedon, built the professional combined army and officer corps, dominated Greece, and prepared the invasion Alexander inherited. Question: what happened to Thebes in 335 BCE, and why did it matter? Answer: Alexander destroyed the rebellious city, killed many defenders, and enslaved many survivors, terrifying most other Greek states into submission. Question: which battle decisively shattered Darius III's ability to hold the Persian Empire together? Answer: the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Question: what does the hammer and anvil analogy explain? Answer: the phalanx held or pinned enemy forces like an anvil, while Alexander's cavalry struck a weak point like a hammer. Question: why did Alexander adopt Persian officials and court customs? Answer: he needed Persian elites and institutions to govern millions of non-Macedonians across a vast empire, though many Macedonians resented the change. Question: what stopped Alexander's advance farther east in 326 BCE? Answer: his exhausted soldiers refused to continue at the Hyphasis, or Bias, river. Question: why did Alexander's empire fragment after his death? Answer: he left no clear, stable succession system, so his generals, the Diadochi, fought for control. Question: what was Alexander's deepest long-term legacy? Answer: not a united empire, but the interconnected Hellenistic world of new kingdoms, cities, trade, shared Greek communication, and two-way cultural exchange.